Chapter 28. The cock crowed at daybreak, and so loud and earnest was his cry that he effectively awoke everyone on the Rains ranch. The workers, grumbling, threw the covers from their bodies and shivered in the chill morning air. Paxton was at the kitchen table, enjoying a freshly steeped herbal tea, and Elizabeth was preparing breakfast when they reached the house.
"Good morning, boys. Help yourselves to some herbal tea, and Lizzie's got eggs and bacon cooking."
His voice was determinedly hearty. Each man greeted Mr. and Mrs. Reign and helped themselves to hot herbal tea, savoring the delicious scent which wafted from their mugs. One of the newer workers circled his fingertip along the rim of his mug attentively. Finally, he looked at Paxton, who had in fact been watching him. Paxton coaxed, "What's on your mind, Harry?" "Is it true that Jack Strom is in jail for murder, sir?" A tense but curious silence fell over the room, the only sound being the crackling and sizzling of bacon frying. The men watched as their boss took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. Paxton knew what Jack Strom meant to all of these boys, and the news of his being a murderer would no doubt shock them as much as it had him. A loud knock on the front door sounded and interrupted Paxton's impending reply. Sheriff John Scythe greeted them as soon as he'd entered the room. At Elizabeth's invitation, he sat down at the table, removed his hat, and placed it on his knee. "Breakfast, Sheriff?" she offered, showing the contents of her frying pans.
"Just some of that tea, please. I've already eaten."
He looked around at the anxious faces scrutinizing him with intense curiosity.
"Well, guess I'd better get on with the reason I'm here."
He thanked one of the men as he handed him a cup of herbal tea.
"I sent a telegram to Wilhelmina Strom's family in New York yesterday after we found the bodies. I got one back today, telling me they haven't heard from Wilhelmina or Jack in years. They're coming here right away with their daughter's letters."
Elizabeth's face brightened slightly. There must be something important in her correspondence for them to come personally. The sheriff nodded, salivating, as she placed a plate of crisp bacon, grits, hash browns, and eggs in front of her husband.
"Are you sure you don't want any, Sheriff?"
Paxton asked, observing the way John was eyeing his food.
"Well—"
Elizabeth didn't wait for his reply, placing a plate of appetizing food in front of him. She smiled somewhat awkwardly, as the feelings she'd harbored against him for so long were difficult to forget.
"The telegram weren't full of details,"
Scythe explained, his mouth full. He chewed slowly, obviously enjoying his morsel, and swallowed.
"Reckon we just have to wait till they get here. Strom's got himself a lawyer, though. Probably have to let him out on bail soon."
Color drained from Elizabeth's cheeks. "Can't you stop that?" The sheriff shook his head.
"Not up to me. Judge Wheeler's coming here, too. This town's never had a proper full-out trial before."
Do you think Jack Strom is guilty, Sheriff? Harry questioned timidly, giving the reins a sideways glance. The sheriff's tongue darted back and forth over his teeth, seeking any leftover food, as he measured Harry. He wiped his rough hands on his pants and nodded. Reckon so. Mrs. Reign, I'll be keeping Wilhelmina's journal with me. Judge Wheeler wants it as evidence during the trial. Of course. If you'll excuse me, I have some things to see to. Elizabeth excused herself hesitantly. I just can't believe Jack would kill anyone, Harry intoned after Elizabeth had gone. He shook his scraggy head. I trusted him. John Scythe patted his belly. All anyone needs, boy, is a motive that means enough to 'em. But cold-blooded murder, Jack? You were always talking about his days as a bounty hunter, hunting down criminals. Maybe he were trying to make up for past wrongs. Maybe. But no doubt in my mind he murdered Eustace Dalton and his wife. Truth's got a way of surfacing sooner or later, and Strom's gonna pay for his crimes. Harry? Everyone in the room had noticed the color drain from the boy's face as he stared through the sheriff. Did you say Dalton, sir? That's right, son. Eustace Dalton, Elizabeth's father. John studied him carefully. Harry's blue eyes widened as he fretfully chewed on his thumbnail, and under his breath he repeated the sheriff's last words. Elizabeth's father. I didn't know. He stopped muttering and looked directly at Paxton. Mr. Reign. The sheriff quickly gestured at Paxton, silencing his reply, and glared the boy down. You got something to hide, boy? Harry, for all his 16 years, could not withstand the sheriff's interrogating glare. He colored and bowed his head. Harry, best come clean now, one of the other men warned gruffly. The entire room was watching the young man keenly as he contemplated his response to the sheriff's question. Finally, he lifted his gaze to Paxton and began to speak. Mr. Reign, Jack was like a father to me. I never knew my own pop. John Scythe cut him off sharply. We don't need your life's story. Yes, sir. Sorry. Dalton was the code name Jack told me to use at the bank, Sheriff, sir. What? Harry went on to explain that a few weeks ago Jack had approached him and asked him for a favor. Jack told him now that things were calming down at the ranch, he planned to return to New York, but he had some unfinished business in town. He then informed Harry he'd invested a large amount of money in the bank years ago, and since he didn't foresee returning any time soon, he wished to withdraw it. Jack said Mr. Reign told him to keep an eye on Mrs. Reign, so he couldn't risk going to town. He asked me to go and get the money, and I swear I didn't think nothing of it. He gave me a paper with the account number and told me to tell him Dalton when they asked for the name. I'd never heard the name before. I got the money and 2 pieces of paper and gave it all to Jack in a large leather satchel he'd given me. What'd the papers say? John queried eagerly. I can't read, sir. Looked right official, though. Paxton looked at the sheriff, who was looking right back, and both of them understood what the other was thinking. Harry, is there anything else you remember? Anything at all? Think very hard, because any little detail could be crucial, Paxton said. Harry shook his head emphatically. Another worker piped up. He don't, but I do. He placed his mug down on the table. Weren't nothing strange until now. I saw Jack in the back stall of the barn, you know, the one that ain't used. He was on his knees, but I didn't see what he were up to. I asked what he was about. Thought he were fixin' something and might need a hand. Well, you'd think I'd caught him murderin' the sheriff's daughter the way he yelled at me to mind my own business and scoot on out of there. I just shrugged it off and went about my work. Paxton grinned at Elizabeth, who had returned at the end of Harry's account of his dealings with Jack Strom. Looks like we might have figured out what was in that jar of cocoa, Lizzie dear. The sheriff stood up, with a similar grin on his face. Yeah, I reckon you're right, Reign. But let's check it out before jumping to conclusions. Harry, in an uncharacteristically bold move, stepped in front of Paxton. Mr. Reign, Paxton put his hand on Harry's shoulder. It's all right, Harry. You didn't do anything wrong. You had no reason to doubt Jack. He pulled the wool over all of our eyes. Thank you for telling us everything. Harry's entire body seemed to relax with relief. Elizabeth saw the admiration in Harry's eyes as he looked at her husband, and she realized that his good opinion meant a great deal to his workers, and that meant a lot to her. Her father had been like that too. She waited for her stomach to churn at the memory of her father, but it didn't. She followed the men out to the barn and watched as they investigated the empty stall. Velvet and Castro watched lazily as they munched on their morning meal. Once the straw and spare bales of hay were removed from the stall, they located a secret compartment concealed under a loose brick. The loose brick and the hidden compartment would never have been found had they not known where to look. Paxton pulled out a large leather satchel and replaced the brick. He unfastened the satchel, glanced inside, and after a wary observation of the onlookers and a moment of deliberation, poured out the contents. Money lay strewn all over the stall floor, and no one moved. Eventually, Elizabeth reached down and picked up the only 3 papers on the floor that were not dollar bills. Those are the ones the banker gave me. He said he'd found instructions to give them to the person who came to collect the money, Harry revealed insistently. Yes, Elizabeth mused, her hands quivering as she flipped the pages. It's the last will and testament of Eustace Dalton, and the deed to his ranch. What's the other piece of paper? Paxton indicated a small, aged note. She carefully unfolded the paper, noting its multiple folds and the fact it smelt strongly of cocoa. Her eyes scanned the writing, and filled with tears. After a moment of composing herself, she cleared her throat and read aloud. My dearest Elizabeth, I reckon if you're reading this, something's happened to me. Best not to mourn for an old codger like me. Below is the number of my account with the National Bank in town. I've managed to save up enough so's you'll have a good start. My will and the deed to the ranch are there too. All I got goes to you, of course. You're my good girl, and I love you. I won't never really leave. I'll be watching out for you, even if it's from beyond this world. Eustace Dalton.
Strom was reckoning to steal your inheritance.
John Scythe began to pick up the cash and return it to the satchel.
I'd better take this as evidence. It'll be returned to you afterwards.
He took the documents from Elizabeth's shaking hands and added them to the satchel.
Sheriff, I don't think you should ride back to town with all that money without an escort. Reckon you're right, Reign. Saddle up. I need to get back to town.
Paxton nodded, additionally recommending a handful of his most trusted workers to accompany them. Elizabeth chose not to return to town with the men. The last person she wanted to see was the man who not only murdered her father, but attempted to deprive her of her inheritance as well. Although all of the men wanted to ride into town, Paxton insisted 2 of them stay behind with his wife. She'd felt bad for the boys because their disappointment had been so obvious, but Paxton wouldn't listen to any arguments on their behalf. Elizabeth was sitting comfortably on the rocking chair in the bedroom, knitting, when she heard the front door open and close. After waiting a few moments for someone to call out, Elizabeth stood up, fully cognizant that everyone on the ranch knew you didn't enter the Reign home without calling out a greeting. Her eyebrows arched suspiciously as she went over to the window and investigated the yard. Spread out halfway between the house and the barn were 2 bodies. The bodies were lying motionless in the dust, and Elizabeth knew instantly what she'd felt from the moment she heard the front door open. She had an unwelcome visitor. She heard a chilling voice behind her. Came back to get my things. It was quite a shock to find them gone. Turning around slowly, she saw Jack Strom silhouetted in the doorway, a gun in his hand. Don't move, Lizzie. He cocked the pistol. I sure know how tricky you can be. How did you get here? She hoped to get him talking, to stall for time until she could think of a way out of this situation. He lifted a single finger to his lips and came within 2 steps of Elizabeth. Shh. I'll ask the questions. Where's my money? Your money? Her lip curled in irrepressible revulsion. It's not your money. He lifted his gun so it pointed directly at her face. You've got 3 seconds to tell me where my money's at. Elizabeth steadied Jack, and by the time he'd reached number 2, decided she'd better tell him what he wanted to know. Sheriff Scythe's taking it to town. Jack walloped the gun across her mouth, and she tasted blood as her lip collided with her teeth.
Dang it! How long ago did he leave?
Elizabeth glowered resentfully at him as she gingerly felt her lip, which was already swelling. About 2 hours or so. He grabbed her arm and pressed the gun against her temple.
You're not lying to me, are you?
No.
I must have missed him since I came the back way. Can't be helped then.
He dragged her toward the doorway.
I need that money, and you're gonna help me collect it.
You know Paxton will come for me.
I'm counting on it.